Part One of Visits to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Visits to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome by George Washington Greene. Part One. La terre avait gémi sous le fer des tyrans, elle cachait encore des martyrs expirants, qui dans les noix des tours des grottes reculées, dérobaient au bureau leurs têtes mutilées. Bernie, Poème de la Religion vengée, Chapter 8. A visit to the catacombs usually comes in as a part of the prescribed round of rites which fill up the traveller's 10 days at Rome. You ride out to San Sebastian, a Cistercian monk leads you through the church, from chapel to chapel and altar to altar, points out the spot where the holy relics are kept, the head of St. Calixtus, an arm of St. Andrew, the oratory where the primitive popes gathered their little flocks around them to say mass over the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul, and the very chair in which they used to sit, and where one of them, St. Stephen, received the crown of martyrdom. It is an old story for him. He has told it half a dozen times to day before you came, and now goes through it again, with the self-same words and genuflections, and in that monotonous showman's tone which would disgust you with the Vatican itself. Then, lighting a taper and giving you another for yourself, he leads you down a narrow staircase, through winding galleries, chilly and damp, which cross and interweave with each other in inextricable labyrinths, and after going a few turns, tells you that it is unsafe to go any further, and that many a rash explorer, venturing merely a step or two out of the common track, has been led no one knew whither, and was never heard of again. You follow him back, picking your way by the dim light of your taper, asking yourself as you look into the darkness of the forbidden galleries, if this is all. Pay your fee at the head of the stairway, and drive home just in time for dinner and your torchlight excursion to the Vatican. Next morning you talk the matter over at breakfast, and come to the conclusion that the interest of the catacombs is, after all, merely a question of the imagination. And you are right. All of these things depend upon the imagination. The pleasure of living at Rome is in a great degree a pleasure of the imagination. The Colosseum is merely a vast pile of stones for 9/10 of the travellers who work themselves up into raptures over its crumbling arches. I once went through the Vatican by torchlight with a very respectable gentleman from Wall Street, who entertained me all the way by a disquisition upon the probable cost of such a building in the United States. If you wish to enter into the spirit of such scenes and enjoy them as they ought to be enjoyed, you must not be in a hurry. They belong to a part of our nature which is too far removed from the common questions of life to be merely the slave of the will. The power of bringing ourselves into communion with those who have lived before us and for us was given to us as a means of refining and purifying the soul, in order to strengthen ourselves for the sacrifices which we, in our turn, must make for those who are to come after us. There is something in it which elevates and expands, and the man who can thus enlarge his conception of his relations with the universe has brought himself nearer to that Being for whom all events and all time are but a single perception, calling forth the same feelings of compassion and love. I had been to the catacombs myself, just as everybody else does on a first visit to Rome, carrying away with me no definite impression, and soon mingling them up in my memory with 20 other objects equally indistinct, because they had all been run over in equal haste. It is wonderful how soon sightseeing may become a bore, particularly with a regular cicerone. I was glad when I was through with it and could enjoy myself in my own way. At last St. Peter's Day came, the first that I had passed in Rome. The church was to be illuminated in the evening, and there were to be fireworks at the castle of St. Angelo. In the morning I went to see the procession and hear the Pope say Mass in St. Peter's. It was in the last year of Leo XII, and the last time, if I remember right, that he ever appeared in public. Even then he looked so faint and feeble as he knelt before the Host that the contrast between his pallid features and the gorgeous pageantry around him reminded you of the corpse of St. Charles Borromeo at Milan, glaring out livid and ghastly from under its robes of state. Still, it was a magnificent spectacle. Friars, monks, priests, bishops, and cardinals moving round that vast square in solemn procession, and slowly passing into the church amidst strains of thrilling music. It is only at Rome that such things are to be seen, and when you have once seen them there, everywhere else they look like childish imitations. In the afternoon I strolled over to the Capitol. Near the foot of the hill, on the side toward the Forum, and nearly opposite to the remains of the Temple of Concord, there is a little church consecrated to St. Joseph and St. Peter. I had passed it 100 times, but somehow or other had never been in it before. But that afternoon there was a crowd about it, and a constant moving in and out, as if there were something more than usual to be seen. I joined the ingoers, and in a few moments found myself in the midst of a throng of men and women, chiefly peasants and people of the lower classes, who were kneeling before the altar. I was decidedly out of place, and was upon the point of stealing quietly out again, when I saw some of them rise, and, crossing themselves, go down a stairway at the side. I followed them. A few steps brought us into a square chapel with an altar richly decked and illuminated with immense wax tapers. Here, too, there were other worshippers praying, and some on the outside looking through a doorway that led directly into the Forum. I now remembered that there were 2 churches here, and that this was St. Peter's, built, as tradition said, directly over the prison where St. Peter and Paul had been confined just before their martyrdom. I was now determined to see it all. Through the open door I could see the first shadows of the evening sinking gently upon the Forum. The music from the chapel above came down upon me in mellow strains, mingling with the whispered prayer of the suppliants at the altar. There was devotion in the atmosphere. I had merely come out for a quiet evening walk, and now found myself yielding for the first time to the Christian associations of Rome. Another flight of steps brought me to the first prison, a square room, built of large blocks of tufa, vaulted, cold, and grave-like, as a Roman prison should be. On one side were the remains of a doorway that led to the steps of groans, where the bodies of criminals used to be thrown after execution. In the middle of the floor was an opening just large enough for a body to pass through it. Through this prisoners were lowered down to the executioner, who stood ready to seize and strangle them in the dungeon beneath. I shuddered as I looked down into the darkness. Modern piety has cut through the floor and made a narrow stairway to the lower prison. It is but a few steps, and you stand in the chamber of death, a low vaulted room, square, and of the same massive blocks of tufa with the prison above, but smaller, colder, and with darkness and the silence of the grave on its walls. It was built by Servius Tullius, and is often mentioned in the annals of Rome. Here Jugurtha was thrown. The fiery monarch knew his victors too well to hope for mercy. "How cold are thy baths, Apollo!" he was heard to exclaim, as the chill air of the dungeon struck upon his frame, still glowing with the fiery sun of Africa, and he was left in darkness and alone to the slow torture of starvation. Others followed, but who or why we know not, till one day the consul, Cicero himself, brought a band of criminals to the prison door. The executioner descended into the lower prison, all ready for his fatal office, and one by one Roman nobles, men of ancient descent and illustrious names, but whose dark minds had nourished horrid hopes of devastation and slaughter, were lowered through that narrow opening. Did they shrink from the deadly grasp, and writhe and struggle against their fate? Or did they yield themselves calmly up and die with Roman fortitude? It is hard to die in open day, with earth and heaven smiling around you, and life looking freshly upon you from hundreds of human eyes, but how easy must even that seem when compared with the silence and solitude of a death like this. And after many years the gloomy door was opened for two other prisoners, who were lowered through this same narrow opening, not indeed to die, but to wait for death. When the jailer had performed his task, and turned to go away, he heard their voices mingling in tones unlike any that he had ever heard from that place till then. Threats and execrations he had been used to, but there was something in the tender and earnest fervour of these men which moved him strangely. At noon he returned with food, and was thanked for this simple performance of a daily duty. At evening the same voices were heard, first in the sweet notes of a hymn of praise, and then in the fervent outpourings of an imprisoned Christian's prayer. Through the night he could hear them still. The strain lingered in his ears, stealing into his soul with a calm and soothing freshness, and awakening thoughts and hopes that he had never known before. At last he descended into the dungeon, for an irresistible impulse seemed to draw him toward these strange beings who could speak and sing so cheerfully in a place that filled every other soul with horror. And when they saw him, they made haste to meet him, greeting him with the Christian's salutation, "Peace be with you. The Lord has chosen you to be a witness with us of the marvels of his grace. Hasten then and bring your fellow keeper, that we may expound to you the doctrines of salvation." And when the two were seated together at the apostles' feet, they were told how Christ had come to redeem the world, and build up a kingdom more glorious than Rome or Babylon. And as they listened, their eyes were opened, and they believed, and prayed that they might be baptized. Then Peter touched the floor with his right hand, and behold, a fountain rose up from the rock, filling the dungeon with the light and music of its waters. And they knelt down and were baptized there. And when the day came in which their teachers were to die, they too acknowledged that they were Christians, and received, like them, the crown of martyrdom. That fountain is still there, its waters welling forth as pure and limpid as if no taint of earth had ever mingled with their current. Their birthplace in the dark recesses of the hill is not darker than the spot in which they came out on their errand of mercy. The sun and moon have never shone upon them. They have never reflected the soft light of the stars, or felt the breath of the airs of heaven. Rising and flowing in mystery, they still keep their course unchanged, ever filling their fountain without overflowing it, and passing away again to depths as mysterious as those from whence they came. As I turned to go away, the light of my taper fell upon an opening in the wall, which in any other place I should have taken for a window. But what had a window to do there? It was closed tight, too, by a board, secured by a bolt, neither of which appeared, by the mold and rust that had gathered upon them, to have been touched for many years. It was evidently no part of the original prison. "Where does this lead?" I asked the priest who had accompanied me. "To the Catacombs." "To the Catacombs from the very heart of the city?" "Yes, they are around and beneath you, everywhere, and no one knows where they begin or end." I would have given anything to have drawn back that bolt and looked down into the darkness. Who could tell what awful secrets lay hidden there? What forms had mingled with that damp and polluted soil? What groans and supplications had been poured forth unheeded in that rayless atmosphere? What unrecorded heroism had bowed there serenely to the fatal decree and met death with the calm smile of submissive hope? I never walked the streets of Rome again without feeling that with every footfall I was awakening an echo in the caverns of death. Still many years passed before I returned to the Catacombs. I could not forget the old Cistercian monk, with his taper and his monotonous sing-song. Whenever the wish to see them came over me, I would go back to the Mamertine prison and look in imagination through that bolted window. At last a learned archaeologist, of the order of Jesuits, was directed by government to make accurate researches in the Catacombs of St. Agnes. He set himself to his task with all the patience of an antiquary, pushing his researches cautiously from passage to passage, and carefully studying every object that he met. The chapels were cleaned, the corridors freed from the dirt that had blocked them up, many of the tombs opened, the inscriptions deciphered and copied, and, to give a more lasting character to his studies, the Pontifical Corps of Engineers was employed for months in tracing out accurate plans of this subterranean labyrinth. Day after day, and month after month, he spent in his task, with an enthusiasm that never flagged and a patience that never grew weary in the minutest details. I have often met him at nightfall on his way back to the city with a triumphant glow upon his face and the quick tread of a man who feels that the day has left a lasting record behind it. It was some time before I could prevail upon him to let me go with him. He seemed to feel an instinctive aversion to opening the doors of this sanctuary to a heretic, and always found the way of putting me off for the moment with some plausible excuse, without actually refusing me. At last, by the intercession of a common friend, he was prevailed upon to name a day and allow me to take a small party with me. We were 5 in all: the padre, 2 Romans, Cole, and myself. It was a beautiful morning in February, a Roman February, with its cloudless sky and balmy atmosphere. As we rode along toward Porta Pia, we could not but pause a moment in our conversation to look over into the vineyard, where Vestals who had broken their vow were buried, still living, in a narrow cell underground, to die there when their loaf was eaten and their cruse exhausted. Their grave may have become a part of the catacombs, and the bones that had lain for centuries unwept been covered by Christian hands. Passing through the gate, we left the Praetorian camp on our right. How often had the fierce soldiery set forth from their stronghold to search for victims in the very spot that we were about to visit as a shrine. Our road led us for a couple of miles between villas and vineyards. The grass was already green. The almond buds were swelling with the blossoms of the new year. Men and women were singing merrily at their work, and everything looked as bright and full of life as if war and famine and pestilence and all the scourges of humanity had never descended upon this lovely spot. But as soon as you pass the villas you leave every trace of cultivation behind you. The ground sinks down to the bed of the Arno, to rise again into precipitous banks, and spread onward to the foot of the mountains, with that undulating surface, that deathlike silence, and that intermingling of ruined aqueducts, temples, and tombs, which give the Campagna, in despite of its luxurious vegetation, the aspect of solitude and desolation. The entrance to the Catacombs was in a vineyard on the left. A small hut had been built over it, and before we entered we paused a moment to look on the mountains. There was Soracte far to the north. There were the Sabine Mountains, girding the horizon with their stern and craggy wall. There were Tiber and Praeneste. There, too, were the Alban hills, with their silent volcanoes and soft outline. There was Rome, with its gray walls and towers, and around us, on every side, the solemn expanse of the Campagna. The sun shone brightly on them all, as it had shone upon them still through all their changes, and the sky seemed to lay its hand gently upon the mountain tops with a touch of love. We gazed for a few moments in silence, and then turned to descend into the city of the dead. The steps were the old ones, with a few repairs. Each of us had a lighted taper in his hand, and Padre M. was so familiar with the path that we had no fear of losing ourselves. A short descent brought us into a vaulted corridor, about 6 feet wide and 8 or 9 high. It was cut out in the bed of tufa which extends in every direction around Rome, and in many places the marks of the pick and spade could still be distinctly traced on the walls. As we advanced we found that it varied in width and height, sometimes rising to 12 feet or more, and then again shrinking to 5. Here and there you could see that the arch had given way, and masses of earth fallen into the passage. On each side were tiers of shelves rising one above the other, like the berths in a steamboat. Some of them were carefully closed up with plaster, with occasionally an olive branch or a dove or some other symbol upon them, as distinct as when they were first traced there by hands that mouldered hundreds of years ago. Many of them had been broken open, and the bones removed for relics. In others we saw the skeleton lying just as it had been placed after death, with a few handfuls of dust gathered closely around it, dust that had once clothed it with loveliness or with strength. Here and there a small opening had been made into the funereal cell, and by thrusting in a torch it would light up for you with a ghastly glare that fell fearfully upon the fleshless bones. It was indeed a solemn sight, like standing face to face with death itself, stripped of all his concealments, no sculptured monument to admire, no green mound to remind you, by its springing grass and fragrant flowers, that the manifold forms of life are full of sweet and soothing exhortations even on the border of the grave, but a narrow cell in the cold, damp earth, and for the decent limbs that the hand of reverence or affection had composed there with pious care, a skeleton, grim, repulsive, and fearfully distinct. While our companions were busy with the inscriptions and symbols, Cole and myself lingered about these open and half open sepulchres. For us, whose home was in a land unknown when these skeletons were living beings, there was a peculiar feeling about them which we knew not how to analyze. They were like voices from some unknown land, such as may sometimes reach the ear of the mariner on a midnight sea, with revelations full of mysterious warning. We could not but ask ourselves whose hand had laid these bodies in their silent cells. whose tears, a father's, mother's, sister's, or friend's, had bathed them before they shrunk into the shapeless dust and grinning skeleton. Once I put my hand in and touched the hand of the skeleton, and it sent a thrill through my veins. It was some time before we could command our feelings enough to observe the other objects that were becoming more and more interesting with every step. In a short time we came to another descent leading to a second corridor, 8 or 10 feet below the first. Here, too, the sides were lined with funereal cells, from which the dead grinned horribly upon us as we passed. The arch was cut out in the same way as in that above, and you could still see by the marks on it what kind of tools it had been made with. Below this was still another line of passages, making 3 stories in all. But one of them, the widest and highest, had no tombs in it, and had evidently been cut out for the tufa and puzzolana above. Padre M. stopped as we reached the lower corridor. "You see now," said he, "the history of the Catacombs. It is written on the walls, plainer and more impressively than I can tell it. In the vast edifices which were built for the pride or wants of old Rome, extensive materials were required. They brought stone from Albano and Tivoli, marble and ornaments from every part of their dominions. But pozzolana, the most important ingredient in that admirable cement which has stood the changes of more than 2000 years, was found at home, in their vineyards, under their streets, everywhere around them. They dug it out, just as you see them dig it now in the Campagna, and if you will take the trouble to compare the modern quarries with the old ones, you will find them running into the hillside in arches and winding galleries, just like those we are standing in. The only difference is in the extent. This was the origin of the Catacombs, and you have only to remember how early they began, and how many thousands of private and public edifices were built from them during the 1000 years of Rome's infancy, youth, and manhood, to see how naturally they would spread their network in every direction. As one was exhausted or carried too far to be used readily, another would be opened, and then again as the new ones began to fail, or the demand for puzzolana was raised by any sudden emergency, the old ones would be opened and worked again, till, in the course of time, half the city was undermined, and the very material that was to be used in building the walls and temples and palaces that we still admire in their ruins were drawn from under the very spots on which they were to stand. And, stern lesson to human pride, the humble quarry remains unchanged, while the pompous structures it helped to furnish forth have long since crumbled away. So much for the beginning of the Catacombs. Let us go a little further before we take up the second epoch in their history. By this time we were somewhat familiarized with this new aspect of death, and could walk between the graves without shuddering. Still we had no disposition to converse, but asked our questions in a whisper, or pointed with a mute gesture to the objects we wished to call attention to. Even the whisper seemed to have a strange sound, and our footsteps as we passed slowly and cautiously along awoke from time to time a hollow reverberation amidst the arches that filled them for a moment, and, growing fainter and fainter, gradually died away in recesses far beyond the light of our tapers. At first we had been so absorbed by the solemn aspect of everything around us that we had scarcely observed the new galleries that branched off in every direction from that which we were following. Every few steps there was a new opening, with the same style of vaulted ceiling, the same countless rows of skeletons, each in his narrow cell, and connected in the same way with other passages that ran out in the same inextricable labyrinths. Here and there, too, there was a passage that had been blocked up, either by design or by the casual falling in of the earth. I stopped from time to time to look in at the open ones, and once ventured a few steps forward to the opening of a third branch. It was easy to see how one might lose himself in them, and easy, too, to conceive what a horrid thing it must be to wander about without clue or light in that awful darkness, and sit down at last to die in the midst of the dead. As I held up my taper, the light fell faintly for a few feet upon the arches and graves, giving a deeper and livid hue to the darkness beyond. I hurried back to my companions, glad enough to reach the gallery in time to see their tapers like dim stars and catch the sound of their footsteps. My companions, two of whom were zealous antiquarians, were immediately engaged in deciphering inscriptions and interpreting symbols. But it was some time before Cole and myself could bring our thoughts into a fit state for a calm examination of anything. We could only feel that we were among the dead of nearly 2000 years ago; that the bones around us had once been the earthly tenement of men who had borne the religion in which we believed through the fierce persecutions of paganism. Some of them, perhaps, had seen Christ himself. Many of them had received their baptism from the hands of the apostles. And above, far above the dark arches that covered us and them, the vineyards and green fields were still smiling in the sweet sunlight and balmy air. At last, though without losing this pervading consciousness of the hallowed influences around us, we began to take our part in the peculiar archaeological characteristics of the place. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Visits to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome by George Washington Greene. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It was evident that the catacombs had been carefully examined long before our day. The greater part of the inscriptions had been removed to the Vatican, where they form that long gallery so full of materials for Christian history, but which travelers often pass through with a hasty glance. Enough, however, remains to show us how the graves must have looked when they were all there. The rows of cells were often as many as 6, one above the other, and whatever the origin of the gallery may have been, they had evidently been cut out for graves. The bottom on which the body lay was solid tufa, with an opening in front large enough to put the body in without discomposing it. The opening had then been filled up with tiles and plaster, forming in some places a sort of panel work, in others a smooth surface of masonry, and then again with a place for the slab that bore the inscription. These slabs were mostly of marble, of various lengths from 1 foot to 3, more or less polished and ornamented according to the rank of the dead or the wealth of his relatives. Those of the earlier ages, the ages of persecution, were by far the rudest, for they belonged to a time when Christians had seldom the means or the opportunity of adorning their graves, however dear the relics which they contained. But at a later period, when their number comprised men of all classes, and still more when Christianity became the religion of the state, money and skill were both directed to this object, and many works of unquestionable merit have been drawn from the catacombs to decorate the museums of the curious and the learned. The inscriptions were cut in the stone, and then colored with some kind of pigment very similar to Venetian red. It is by no means sure, however, that the custom of coloring them was universal, for many are found without any traces of color, so much so, indeed, that it is hard to believe it could have been so completely effaced. The letters are from half an inch to 4 inches high, some very rudely cut, and just the kind that an antiquary loves to pore over; others neat and in the most approved style of lapidarian art. The symbols were usually traced with a sharp instrument, sometimes a chisel; the more elaborate apart by themselves, the others interwoven with the inscriptions. "But wait a few moments," said Padre M. "In answer to our demands for explanation, a little further on there is a chapel in which we can sit down and talk more at leisure." The chapel was one of those enlargements made by the Christians when they came to look upon the catacombs as places of asylum or worship. It was cut out in a tufa on each side of the corridor, in a style of architecture which will be more readily understood by the annexed engraving of a similar one in another catacomb than by any description of it that I can give. The graves were empty, and everything that was thought worthy of a place in the Vatican removed. Over the altar there was a head of the Virgin, which the padre pointed to with an eloquent gesture that was intended to silence our Protestant scruples forever. Cole examined it very carefully, and whispered in my ear that it was later by several hundred years than anything else that he had seen there. "Ask him to let us sketch it," said he, but the padre answered no. "And now," said he, "I will go on with my history of the catacombs. They were first opened, as I have already told you, for the sake of the Puzzolana. Cicero speaks of them in his oration for Cluentius as arenarias quastum extra portam Esquilinam. Now, the Esquiline Hill was so notorious a place, both on account of the bad air and the robbers that infested it, that it was at last entirely abandoned by the better classes, and came in time to be used only as a burial place for the poor. Horace speaks of it as a place to which slaves brought the corpses of their fellow slaves in miserable coffins, the common sepulchre of the wretched plebs. And I remind you of Cicero and Horace, because some writers have supposed that when the catacombs came to be used for burial places, Christians and pagans were both interred in the same spot. This we know by positive testimony to be incorrect. The arenarias used by the heathen were those of the Esquiline, which were closed up when Maecenas built his gardens there, many years before the introduction of Christianity, and another spot 3 miles from the city was set apart for burning the bodies of the poor. Under Augustus the work of building and embellishing was continued upon the largest scale. You remember his boast, that he had found a Rome of brick and left one of marble. And for brick work and marble work both, the arenarias or sand pits were in constant requisition. The workmen employed in them were naturally men of the lowest class, who devoted themselves especially to this kind of labor, passed all of their days underground, and became perfectly familiar with all the passages of the subterranean city they had built. Their only guide was in the veins of Puzzolana, and when these failed they stopped or turned off in another quarter. In this way quarries were opened in every direction around the city, and sometimes in the city itself. You can easily conceive what many hundred men could do, constantly working to supply the wants of a city like Rome. Bosio tells us, as the result of his own observations, that everywhere between the Pincian and Salarian gates the ground is undermined. He found entrances in almost every vineyard, some of them more or less blocked up, but still with a sufficient opening to allow him to make his way into them. Many villas and houses that had been built above them have fallen and been abandoned, for often when the foundations had been carried down to the first gallery, a second and even a third and fourth were found still deeper down into the heart of the soil. Occasionally, when they had run their vein very far, they would open an air hole into the vineyard or field above, through which a faint ray and warmer atmosphere would steal in to cheer them. These were the luminaria which are occasionally mentioned by old writers, and which you must have seen more than once in your rambles over the Campagna. Many a traveller has found them in his path when he least suspected it. Now we must remember that the early converts to Christianity were chiefly of the lower class, men and women to whom paganism held out no certain promises of future happiness as a compensation for their actual suffering. They were degraded, abject, oppressed beings, whom the new doctrines raised at once to the consciousness of moral dignity. Some, too, were of the better classes, with wealth and power at their command, but whose minds were too earnest and their hearts too warm to allow them to hesitate between Christ and Jupiter. The two classes now met for the first time, drawn together by common hopes and dangers, and many a proud Roman learned to embrace as a brother the being whom, but a little before, he would hardly have deigned to recognize as a man. When persecution came, it naturally fell first upon the wealthier and more prominent members of the new society, leaving their humbler brethren for a while under the shelter of their social insignificance. Here the poor sand diggers could become the protectors of their fellow Christians, secreting them in the grottos and caverns which nobody else could venture into with safety. While the persecution lasted, they would naturally watch around the entrances, to keep dangerous feet aloof, now and then, perhaps, open a new passage for greater convenience or security, and choose the safest hours for conveying food and clothing to their guests. If the storm increased, they too found themselves obliged to seek shelter there, and call upon other friends for means of sustenance. When the persecution was over, they would all come out again to the light of day, the rich to return to their houses, the arenaria to divide their time once more between their sand pits below ground and their houses above. Yet when they met again in their agapite, or for worship, they would find many places empty that had been filled, till then, by the holiest and best beloved of their order. And when they went out into the world and mingled once more with their fellow citizens, they would be told how this one or that whom they loved had died by the hand of the executioner or in the combats of the arena. How gratefully would they then look back to their own escape and the place which had given them refuge, and how naturally would they begin to feel as if they could see the hand of Providence in this hollowing out of their subterranean asylums. And soon they would wish to find an asylum for their dead also, where their bones could be laid in peace, secure against the insult to which they were exposed in common sepulchres, and, what they had equally at heart, secure that no pagan corpse would contaminate the ashes of those who had died in Christ. I could give you more than one passage in confirmation of this, if the feeling were not too natural a one to admit of a doubt. To make a place for the corpse, these little cells were opened which still line the corridors, a circumstance which gives us the means of deciding what parts of the catacombs were mere sand pits, and which the asylum and burial place of the early Christians. Thus they soon found themselves bound to these places by a double feeling, a grateful recollection of their own escape, and that veneration which we naturally feel for the burial place of our kindred and friends. In the intervals of persecution they would come back to them from time to time, to converse more freely with the companions of their peril, the poor sand diggers. Whenever a new body had been laid there, they would feel that the spot which held it had acquired a new claim upon their affections. Whenever their hearts faltered or grew faint, they might come here too to seek strength in prayer at the side of the graves of those who had died for the faith. And may we not safely say that oftentimes the veteran Christian would bring some new convert with him, to show him what he must be prepared to do if he would hold fast to his profession? Have they not often paced these galleries together, a wife perhaps with a newly converted husband, a father with his son, or a friend holding in the warmest grasp of love the hand of the friend whom he had won over by prayers and entreaties, pausing now and then to point out the grave of some martyr from whose holy life and holier death he had drawn his most touching appeals, and exciting each other by sweet communion to stronger faith and more fervent love. How sweet must it have been to talk of heaven in these sunless depths of earth! How must their imaginations have been exalted by the objects that surrounded them, and with what an increase of boldness and vigour must they have gone forth again to preach, to reason, and perhaps to die! New persecutions brought them or their successors back again to the Catacombs, where at first they lived as they had done before, dependent upon their friends for the means of sustenance. However, as the number of Christians went on increasing, it would become more and more difficult for them to live here in safety without some surer supply of food than what they could thus receive day by day from above. Water they found in abundance in the wells and springs, so many of which still remain scattered here and there through the grottos; but bread could only be obtained in safety and abundance by laying in supplies before the danger came. There can be but little doubt that the danger of their position made them peculiarly attentive to all the signs of the times. Every circumstance would be carefully noted, and every new indication of peril instantly perceived. They would become clear sighted, but firm, vigorous, and ever watchful, like men whose path leads them along the brink of a precipice. It would soon be natural for them to look forward to persecution as a danger for which they must always be prepared, and to the Catacombs as a place which might at any hour become their asylum or their grave. I will not say that it was so, but I think we have every reason to suppose that there were careful men among them, who kept supplies of grain where they could convey them at a moment's warning to some one of the numerous entrances to the Catacombs. And for the same reason the Catacombs themselves were enlarged, and new passages pushed forward, till they all became united into a vast network that undermined the whole city. Thus escape became easy and pursuit difficult. The Christian would readily plunge into those dark recesses wherever he found an entrance, for he knew that he could not wander far without meeting a friend. But his pursuer would pause and weigh the danger well before he ventured to follow him into a labyrinth to which he had no clue, and where every step might bring him unawares into the midst of men whom he believed capable of the most revolting crimes. For if we would form a just conception of the position of the Christian among pagans, we must remember that he was looked upon as a fierce, morose, and hateful being, who united himself with men equally detestable, to eat the flesh of human victims, and partake of rites too horrible to be described. And it may well be supposed that when they were known to have chosen their asylum in these dark vaults under the gardens and vineyards of the city, where the sun had never penetrated, and whose recesses were known to themselves alone, their choice would be employed as a new argument against them, if not an open confession of guilt. The first catacombs that we positively know to have been used for this purpose were the Catacombs of St. Sebastian, though we have no authentic account of their opening. Puzzolana, as you well know, is very abundant in all that region, and it is not improbable that the first excavations were begun at a very early period. However this may be, our earliest records of persecution speak of them as the asylum of the Christians, and they continue to be expressly mentioned long after the number of converts had become so great as to compel them to seek for safety in others. It was in these that St. Stephen was put to death. The soldiers came upon him as he was in the act of saying mass, and whether from a momentary feeling of compassion, or a desire to see with their own eyes one of those ceremonies of which they had heard such horrible descriptions, allowed him to go on and accomplish his holy task in peace. but the moment that it was done they thrust him back upon his chair, the very chair which you have seen in the relic chamber of the church, and cut off his head. Well might the recollection of the atrocious deed sink deep into the memory of his horror-stricken brethren, and the ground that had drunk his blood become sacred to all succeeding generations. You must remember that all this while the work of building still went on, and new excavations were constantly making to meet the demand for materials. There was the golden home of Nero, stretching from the Palatine over the Esquiline, where he died. There were the baths and the Colosseum, which Titus built upon the site of that vast and odious edifice, and forums and temples and theatres and mausoleums, and the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian, all built while the Christian was still an odious and dreaded member of the great empire. Sometimes he was condemned to work as a punishment in these caverns, which might soon serve him for an asylum, and which he alone was known to look upon with affection. And thus various and often opposite causes seemed to concur in preparing for him a home in the hour of danger, and showing how easily God converts the designs of his enemies into means of protection for his own children. We have no authentic description of the beginning of a persecution, but it is a scene which the imagination easily draws in a place like this. I have often sketched it to myself in my daily walks hither. It would seldom come wholly unawares upon men so well read in the signs of danger. Here and there a significant cloud would be seen by them, however pure the horizon might seem to an untrained eye. Some friend in the palace, anxious, though not a Christian himself, for the safety of a Christian relative or friend, would secretly convey the warning that a new edict was preparing, and the names of prominent victims already marked. Then the infirm and weak, women and children, and all those who might become encumbrances in a sudden flight, would repair secretly to their places of refuge, with provisions and all the appliances of comfort which they could carry with them. Daylight would find many an empty dwelling where evening had closed upon a crowded home. Then the edict would issue forth, and soldiers, guided by spies and informers, set out upon the search of victims. Some they would always find either willing martyrs or men whom the hope of a day's respite had prevented from flying in time. These they would hurry off to prison and trial. When night returned, there would be a great stir among the Christians, and hasty preparations for flight. They would scarcely dare to go in large bodies, for fear of attracting attention, but steal away one by one, or at the utmost 2 or 3 together, of those whom no peril could separate. The soldiers, too, would be on the alert, watching the gates and the principal entrances to the catacombs. Often the flight must have been a perilous one, over vineyards and fields, through byways and lanes, finding the path already occupied by their enemy, or hearing their footsteps and seeing the gleam of their torches as they came on in full pursuit. But there were many entrances unknown to any but the Christians themselves, and sometimes perhaps a band of soldiers, in full sight of their victims, might have paused in amazement, well nigh bordering upon terror, at seeing them suddenly disappear when their hands were already almost upon them. Then they would recall all the horrible things that they had heard about these worshippers of unknown gods, and hasten back with strange tales of magic and enchantment. Sometimes, too, they must have met face to face, and here all that we know of these fathers of our faith assures us that they yielded themselves up, like their Saviour, unresisting victims. Sometimes, too, they would meet together at the mouth of a catacomb, and then the Christian would plunge boldly into the darkness, and though it is known that the soldier would sometimes follow them a little way, they seldom ventured far. It was on these occasions that some of the passages which are still blocked up were closed, and while the pursuer was cautiously advancing by the broader gallery, the fugitive would already be far on his way, by other paths, toward the deep recesses of his asylum. Part 3 of Visits to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome, by George Washington Greene. This recording is in the public domain. We know more positively what kind of lives they led here. Their first impulse on finding themselves in a place of safety was to unite together in thanksgiving and prayer. Then here, as in the city above, the different offices of social and religious life would be assigned to different persons, some to watch over the sick, some to preside over the distribution of food, some to allot appropriate places to different ages and sexes, some to watch the entrances, and keep up some kind of communication with their friends in the city. The community of feeling and interests which bound them together in the world would become a yet stronger tie in these homes of common peril and privation, and few would think of preserving here those distinctions of rank and power which might so soon be confounded in a common death. For light they used those little lamps of which you see so many in every museum. The larger were suspended from the ceiling in the chapels and main galleries, and they would carry about the smaller ones in their hands whenever they wished to go from one place to another. Some of the wells from which they drew their water may have been dug expressly for that purpose, but others were evidently found in the natural progress of excavation. Some, too, seem to have been used as drains. Their supply of food must, even on the supposition of long preparation, have been a precarious one whenever the persecution lasted more than 3 or 4 months. In the cases of individuals, we know that they depended entirely upon their friends above. St. Chrysostom finds materials for an eloquent reproof to the Christians of his own day in the picture of a noble lady awaiting in fear and trembling the return of her maid with her daily supply of food. There is that beautiful story of Hippolytus, too, who lived for a long while in the catacombs of St. Sebastian, at the very time when St. Stephen was secreted there. He was apparently the only Christian of his family, and when he took refuge in the catacombs he was still obliged to look to his relations for the means of sustenance. They sent it to him by his nephew and niece, children of 10 and 13, whose daily visits in this hour of trial made the poor Christian feel how dear he still was to his friends. And as he thought of them, and mourned over their idolatry, he felt his heart bleed and yearn for them, and could not still his longings till he had found out some way for bringing them also to the knowledge of Christ. Then he went to St. Stephen and told him of his sorrows, and the holy pontiff bade him keep the children by him the next time that they came. For their parents, said he, will become alarmed when they see that they do not return at the accustomed hour, and will come to seek them themselves. And when the children came he kept them, and their parents, seeing that the hour was past, and they had not returned, went to seek them in the place where they knew that their brother was hidden. And when they had reached it, they found their children there, and Hippolytus and the holy bishop with them. But they turned a deaf ear to the prayers and entreaties of their brother, and refused to hearken to the words in which St. Stephen would have reasoned with them. Yet, although they knew it not, their hearts were touched, and the words had sunk into them, and in God's chosen time ripened into repentance, and they too became Christians and martyrs. Still, it was only in individual cases that a large number could have been fed by daily supplies. The very sight of so many persons going regularly to the same places would have excited suspicions in those suspicious times, and led to effectual measures for cutting off the communication. No large body of men could ever have been fed by means like these, and the inhabitants of the Catacombs must often have been exposed to great want. But while they remained there, they passed the greater part of their time in religious conferences, in attending the holy ceremonies, and in prayer. There was no sun to tell them of the passage from day to night. The light that faintly stole in through the luminaria reached at the utmost but a few feet in the upper corridors, and the luminaria themselves were found only at great intervals. All the rest was lighted by lamps, which shed a soft twilight around them, fainter even than this of our tapers, and many a passage was left in unbroken darkness. When I first came here, I could not look into that darkness without a strange feeling. You see how the light falls there, struggling for a little way through the thickening shadows, till its redness fades to a sickly white, resembling that Fioco Lunae, that pale light which Dante saw the spirits by on the shores of Acheron. And then, too, how dark is the darkness beyond! The eye shrinks from it, and turns for relief to that pale ray again, which seems to fall blunted and powerless from the ebon mass. How truly does that other epithet of Dante apply here too, loco d'ogni luce muto, a spot mute of all light, for nowhere do darkness and silence seem to walk hand in hand as they do here. I have repeated it 100 times. By degrees, however, I became accustomed to it, and so it must have been with the Christians who made their homes here. Some of them found employment, too, in enlarging the passages into chapels and forums where they could assemble in larger numbers for conference and worship. It was then, probably, that the rough shell of the chapels was made, though the ornament and finish must have been the work of a calmer and happier period. Sometimes, it is related, the soldiery came upon them while they were engaged in prayer, led thither perhaps by spies. Few only could have been taken in these rare inroads, for there were too many avenues of escape to admit of a general arrest. Sometimes, too, their relentless persecutors would attempt to distress them by throwing in stones and dirt through the luminaria, and shutting out their scanty share of daylight. But none of these things could have broken their general feeling of security in such hiding places as these. The air, as you can tell by your own feelings, was temperately cool, though in some places I have found the dampness unpleasant. Had these grottos been less extensive, the crowds that were sometimes collected here, and the numerous lamps that were always burning, would have made the air unpleasant with such imperfect means of ventilation as the luminaria afford. But these numberless passages, running off in every direction, would give it a circulation that the lungs would play in as freely as on a mountain side. Do you suppose, asked Cole, that many died here? We have no means of ascertaining how many, replied the father, but without some miraculous suspension of the ordinary laws of nature, there must have been the usual proportion both of births and deaths. Whole families were living here together, and often for many months, and doubtless some came who were never to look upon the sun again. Death must have been very solemn in a place like this, but it was one from which the Christian soul would take its flight with exultation. And I doubt whether amidst all their vicissitudes these asylums of holy men have ever witnessed such touching scenes as when a dying saint has breathed his last farewell to kindred and friends, and calmly closed his eyes amidst the prayers and congratulations of those who longed to follow him. You would almost fancy the spirit hovering for a moment above them with the last yearnings of human love, and blending, as it were, the purest feelings of earth with its first fruition of heaven. The funeral rites were simple. The corpse was bathed, anointed, and wrapped in its grave clothes, and then placed on a bier in the chapel, where it remained till a sufficient time had elapsed to guard against its premature burial. Meanwhile, relatives and friends would gather round it to watch and to pray, and when the hour came they would take it up in their arms and bear it to the grave that had been opened for it, laying it decently in its narrow dwelling with its arms stretched by its sides and its face upward. Then there would be a last farewell, a parting glance, and when all had joined once more in prayer, the mason would come with his tiles and mortar and shut it out from their sight forever. I have never opened a grave without asking myself where were the hands that closed it hundreds of years ago. Often in opening them you perceive an odor of incense, as if precious gums and spices had been used in preparing the body for its last resting place. And were the remains generally found in the state which we see them in? Frequently, but not always. You have seen that many of the cells were empty. Now you must not always take this for a proof that the bones have been carried away. The nature of the ground, the age of the dead, and various other causes have acted after death, producing a great diversity in the state of the bones. The bones of children decay rapidly, and in their graves we never find anything but dust. Where the puzzolana is dry, the bones become white and soft, falling away like ashes beneath your touch. Where it is damp, you often find the skeleton well preserved, and always more or less perfect. And if it has been reached by the water, an incrustation forms upon it, giving it the color and hardness of stone. Sometimes a striking change takes place the moment that the air penetrates, and I have seen parts crumble away and sink into dust before I had well caught the outline. You remember what happened to Campana? He was carrying on his excavations in his vineyard at Porta Latina, and had just opened a columbarium. All the upper part was arranged just as the columbaria always are, with the urns in their niches and each with its inscription beside it. But on reaching the bottom and clearing away the dust and rubbish from the floor, they came unexpectedly upon a stone coffin a little more than 5 feet long and perfectly closed. By good fortune Campana himself was there, and with the proper instruments for raising the lid without breaking it. And what should he see there but a body stretched at full length in the coffin, as if it had never been disturbed since the day when it was first placed there. The funeral robe, the hands, the limbs in perfect preservation, and the face that of a girl who had died in her freshness and bloom 2000 years ago. But as he was gazing upon it, it suddenly began to dissolve and fade, and in an instant all that was left was the outline of a human form traced in dust upon the bottom of the coffin. The same thing occurred in an excavation at Siri, says Generelli, and I mean to make the most of it in my dissertation. The figure was that of a man, and some of the gold ornaments of his robe resisted the action of the air, though all the rest and the bones crumbled away immediately. Do you believe, asked Cole, that the emblems and inscriptions were placed upon the grave at the time of burial? Many of them undoubtedly were. The simpler emblems and ruder inscriptions may have been easily traced by the common workmen. Some of them evidently were made with the point of the trowel. What is the meaning of the palm leaf? The Christian's triumph, victory over sin and death. Many writers have supposed it to have been a sign of martyrdom. But the only unquestionable proofs of martyrdom are the little vase of blood which you have seen inserted in the cement that closes the grave, and the instruments of martyrdom which are sometimes found in the grave itself. I have been told that these were indications of the buried man's trade. Yes, when you find them cut or painted on the outside, of which we have many curious instances. I remember a slab which once stood upon the grave of a wool comber. The inscription gives nothing but the name, with the common addition of "in peace," Venerle in pace. But there, in the same rude style of carving, are the shears, the comb, the speculum, and a plate with a rounded handle, all implements of his trade. It was a symbolical language, intelligible even to the unlettered. The man who would have been forced to turn away unsatisfied from an inscription would recognize at once the familiar indications of a trade. Men, too, situated as the Christians were, would naturally resort to symbols for the expression of ideas which none but they could appreciate. Their thoughts and hopes were not those of the heathen, who adorned their sarcophagi with choice sculptures and exquisite embodiments of mythology. They did not care to employ in commemoration of their dead the forms which had been defiled by a corrupt superstition. They were in the warmth and fervour of a new hope, which they took every opportunity of expressing in language perfectly intelligible to all who shared it with them. You cannot take 10 steps in the lapidarian gallery of the Vatican without feeling that you are standing between two worlds. On one side are the inscriptions of paganism, whose dead, sinking into their graves without a hope, seem to cast back longing glances upon the pleasures they have left behind. The mourner has nothing to console him, the dying man nothing to cling to. But when the name has once issued from the fatal urn, he leaves for ever his woods, his villas, and his home for the bark that is so to bear him to an eternal exile. I have ventured to borrow from one of the saddest yet most beautiful of Horace's odes, the third of the second book, to Delium. Then from his tomb comes a cold voice that chills you by its heartlessness, an idle enumeration of idle pleasures, or a spiteful warning that yours too will soon be ended. D. M. T. Claudi secundi hic secum habet omnia balneae vinum, Venus corruptunt corpora nostra, sed vitam faciunt B.V.V. To the divine manes of Titus Claudius Secundus, here in this world he enjoys everything, baths, wine, and love, ruin our constitutions, but they make life what it is. Farewell, farewell. What language for the grave! You remember the dying question of Augustus to his friends, "Have I played my part well?" Then applaud. Shocking as this is to our conceptions, even from such a wretch as Augustus, the following inscription is still more so. Vixi dum vixi bene iam mei peracta, mox vestra aegetur fabula, valete et plauditi V.A.N. 58. While I lived well. My play is now ended. Soon yours will be. Farewell, and applaud me. But the Christian for whom death was a passage, not to exile, but to the home of all his hopes and aspirations, writes nothing upon his grave but the simple expression of his faith. Florente in pace. Florentius in peace. Valeria dormit in pace. Valeria sleeps in peace. Dormitio Elpides, the sleeping place of Elpides. Often, too, the expression is fuller and more distinct, referring this peaceful slumber to the Lord who gives it, as in the following form, which is found at the close of many inscriptions: In pace Domini dormit. He sleeps in the peace of the Lord. In the epitaph of Albania by her husband Placus, the idea of repose is expressly limited. The resurrection of the body, an idea that to a pagan would have seemed still stranger than the more common assurance of peace, being held up as the end of this temporary slumber. Relictis tuis iaces in pace sopere, merita resurgis temporalis tibi data requiescio. Thou well-deserving one, having left thy relations, lie in peace, in sleep. Thou wilt arise, a temporary rest is granted thee. Indeed, it is to this belief in the resurrection of the body that we are indebted for the preservation of these precious remains. Natural as it is to honor the dead, and your favorite Vico makes funeral rites one of the first elements of civil union, the Christian, living in the midst of a hostile community, and often dying the most degrading or revolting death, would frequently have been tempted to cast aside, with comparative indifference, the mutilated remains of the friend whose spirit he knew to be far beyond the reach of human decay. But when he saw in them, all disfigured as they were, the substance which was to rise again refulgent with the immortality of paradise, he gathered them together with a pious care, washed and anointed them, and filled the wounds with spices and precious ointments, laid them reverently in the sepulchre. Prudentius tells of a martyr who on his way to death begs not for life, but burial. Sometimes they chose their burial place during life. There is an inscription in the lapidarian gallery, one of the rudest, both in the style of writing and its almost unintelligible Latininity, which records the name of an old man of 90, by the name of Martyrius, who had done so elixit domum vivus. Then, too, we find epitaphs denouncing a wretched death to any one who should dare to violate the sanctity of the sepulchre. Male pereat in sepultus iacet, non resurgat, cum iuda partem habeat, si quis sepulchrum hunc violaverit. If any one shall violate the sepulchre, let him perish miserably and remain unburied. Let him lie down and not arise again. Let his portion be with Judas. Strange, said Cole. Why is it the very sentiment that we find in the epitaph of our great poet Shakespeare, though much more definite in its imprecation? Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Yes, it is man's natural feeling. Even the pagans felt it as keenly as we do. Archytas begs for a little sand in the sweetest note of the lyre of Horace. Et tu non te vage ne parce malignus Ariane ossibus et capiti inhimato particulam dare. And the imprecation, though less minute, is as strong as that of our inscription, Precibus non liqueber inultas, teque piacula nulla resolvant. But the heathen dreaded the sad wanderings on the banks of Styx. Palinarus cries to Aeneas, Eripi me his invicte mals, ant tu mihi terran iusse manu potes. Funeral rites carried a privilege with them, but the body itself had done its part and could never be reunited with the spirit. A decent grave, or even a little dust, thrice sprinkled, would secure the soul a passage in Charon's bark, and then all the rest might be left to slumber undisturbed. How different from the feeling with which the Christian laid his brother in the grave, firmly trusting that every particle which had entered into the composition of that lifeless form would be gathered together and united again in the day of his reward. Another trait which strikes you in these inscriptions is their simplicity. Not merely the simplicity of good taste, but the meekness and resignation of men who looked upward, receiving all things as expressions of God's will, and claiming nothing for themselves but the privilege of submission. The epithets are terms of endearment or respect. Sometimes the manner of death is mentioned, but without any tokens of exultation or any complaints of persecution. They sleep in peace, in the peace of the Lord, in the hope of resurrection, and thus their story is told. The names, too, you must have observed, are merely the name of baptism. The Roman distinction of personal, family, and surname is dropped. They have renounced the pride of birth and place, and care nothing for the pompous titles of worldly power. Many of them were poor laborers who were known only by their trade, the weaver, the wool comber, or any other of the humbler arts that minister to the wants of life. But they all had been baptized by some distinctive appellation, and this they gloried in. It was the token of their regeneration, the mark by which they were known among their brethren, a record of the day in which they began to live anew, casting their errors and unholy affections behind them. Here, then, said Generelli, we have the explanation of the loss of family and surnames in the Middle Ages, which was followed by such a confusion of persons that the genealogist is completely at fault, till the Crusades come to his aid with their armorial bearings and new distinctions. Undoubtedly, and hence the futility of attempting to trace any of our modern families up to the Romans of old. And thus, too, you see another reason for the natural growth of a new symbolical language. These men, who wished to separate themselves, both in life and death, from their pagan neighbors, would naturally inscribe the distinction on their graves in some simple and definite manner. One of the simplest was the monogram of the Greek name of Christ, a chi and rho crossed in various ways, which appears in a very large number of inscriptions, sometimes alone, sometimes adorned with palm branches or other emblems of the same expressive character. In one inscription, that of a child of 4, only a part of one of the legs of the chi appears, and that is wrought into the rho in such a manner as to produce a cross. Then 2 other letters were added, expressive of the attribute of eternal existence as applied to God, Alpha and Omega, one on the right, the other on the left of the cross, and either higher or lower, as best suited the engraver. Another emblem, and which I believe to be a probable, if not a certain, indication of martyrdom, is the furnace which we often find, and in various shapes. It alludes to death by fire, or by boiling oil, both of them common forms of martyrdom. This symbolism was not confined to tombstones. We find it on gems, on lamps, and in pictures. The Christian Museum contains many curious and instructive specimens of it. There is a signet ring from the Catacombs with the monogram of Chi Rho interwrought, and supported by what would seem to have been intended for doves. A full alpha is cut on the right of the Rho, and a little higher, on the opposite side, a very small omega. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Visit to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome, by George Washington Greene. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Another common symbol is a fish, which we find both on slabs and on lamps. Here the idea is a little more difficult to seize, and gave free scope to a play of fancy better suited to an Eastern than a Western mind. You will see the direct meaning by remembering that the Greek word for fish is ichthos, each of whose letters is the initial of one of the words in the inscription Iesus Christos Theou huios soter, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Savior. This symbol was regarded with singular favor by some of the Fathers, and is especially recommended by St. Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, as suggestive of the holy rite by which Christians were received into the bosom of the Church. But a more pleasing and less fanciful symbol is that of the anchor, the soothing monitor on life's troubled sea, that there is still a haven and rest for the tempest-tossed and weary. It was a thought full of a consolation which none but the Christian knew, and when he traced the symbol on the grave of one whom he loved, and called to mind the perils they had encountered together, Rest, he would say, sweet spirit, rest in thy Lord. Thy cares and trials are over, and now thou canst hold strongly to the haven thou hast won. Fortiter occupa portum. The ship belongs to the same class, and is still the symbol of the Church. La navicella di San Pietro, the bark of St. Peter, is one of our current expressions, and the rudest peasant will interpret this symbol for you as easily as the profoundest antiquarian. We find it on tablets and rings. Clement of Alexandria speaks of certain signet rings with a heaven-bound ship upon them. Naus uravod ramovosa. In some of them the symbols are very complicated, but generally it is perfectly simple, a ship more or less accurately drawn, and with a cross for its mast. Does not this symbolism extend to painting and sculpture? Asks Cole. Yes, as for example in the painting from the Catacombs of St. Calixtus, in which our Saviour is represented as a lamb standing upon a rock, or perhaps a mountain. From the base of the rock 4 streams issue like 4 cataracts, and within a circle that surrounds the lamb's head are the monogram of the Chi Rho with an Alpha and Omega. The rock is supposed to be the rock of Paradise, and the 4 streams the 4 evangelists. But what strikes you most in the art of the Catacombs is the general absence of painful elements. The subjects are drawn chiefly from the Old and New Testament, and more especially from the life of Christ. The sacrifice of Abraham is a favorite subject, which reappears in different places, but mostly with the same types. Noah, too, supplies the pious artist with the means of adorning a great many chapels, but almost always in the same way, a man in a sort of open tub, and a dove with an olive branch. The trial of the fiery furnace, Jonah and the whale, Moses striking the rock, Daniel and the lions, and various other passages of sacred history are repeated again and again, but always in a way that does more credit to the artist's piety than to his skill. Some of the most singular, if not the most pleasing of these pictures, represent the miracles or other passages in the life of Christ. The raising of Lazarus is one, the miracle of the loaves and fishes another. Neither of them very successful in invention, for in the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the artist, not knowing how to bring in Christ and the apostles, has contented himself with a group of men kneeling, as if the miraculous supply had just been consumed, while the fragments are piled up in 7 baskets in the foreground. The most common emblem under which Christ appears is that of the Good Shepherd. He is generally represented by the figure of a youth in shepherd's clothing, standing in the midst of his sheep, with one of them upon his shoulder. In some of these, though we find the same monotony and poverty of invention to complain of, the general effect is very pleasing, and the figure of Christ often happily conceived. But we must remember that though art was sometimes resorted to by the Christians as a means of embellishment, they never looked to it for their chief pleasures as the pagans did. Indeed, they were necessarily cut off from the great school of Greece, whose mythological subjects were loathsome and revolting to them. It was not till after the days of persecution were past that they could openly address themselves to the task of adorning their sanctuaries with choice sculptures and paintings, and then, alas, the progress of decay had been too great to afford the Christian school any chance of competing with the bright ages that were gone. One thing, however, to which all writers and the works themselves bear witness, is the gentle and soothing spirit which pervades it. It is eminently the school of love, the school of pure thoughts, enabling suggestions and elevating impulses. The atmosphere that you breathe there has a freshness and purity in it which it would be in vain to seek in the palmiest days of pagan art. Artistically, you may be dissatisfied and even annoyed, but still, if you have any of the Christian's spirit within you, you will go back and look again, till your fancy pictures to you the unlettered believer struggling with his conceptions, and striving to convey to the stone or roughly plastered wall some part of that love and devotion that glow in his heart. And then you will feel with him, and these rude lines will swell out into soft and graceful proportions, and the half-formed features will beam with the light of the soul, and you will learn to number among your happiest days the day in which your eyes were first opened to the real characteristics of Christian art." The padre paused, as though his story were ended, but we all called earnestly for the sequel to the history of the Catacombs. "It is not a very long one," said he. "The Catacombs had gradually become the exclusive property of the Christians. If not formally, yet for all purposes but the mere quarrying of sand, for which the demand necessarily diminished when the troubles of the empire began. After they had become accustomed to them as places of burial and refuge, they began to resort to them for worship also, and those agapitae, or feasts of love, which were so incomprehensible to the pagans. Soon we find in the edicts special clauses expressly forbidding them to collect together in their cemeteries, or even to visit them." And here we may remark that the name of arenarii was rapidly changing into that of cemeteries, though we do not meet with that of catacombs till many years later, and as cemeteries they were regarded as belonging solely to the Christians. The wealthy Romans still loved the costly monuments of the Appian Way, and the emperors built themselves mausoleums that their ashes might lie, like those of Egyptian kings, in piles that would defy the tooth of time. But the costliest monuments of the Appian were destroyed centuries ago. Rope dancers and mountebanks play their antics over the ashes of Augustus, and the frescoed cell of Hadrian re-echoes with the wailings of guilt and despair. While here, around the bones of the humble and persecuted Christian, the children of a land unknown to Rome come, as you have done to-day, to unite with the children of the soil in tributes of gratitude and veneration. At last the persecutions ceased. Constantine came with privileges and favors, and the great offices of the empire passed into the hands of the Christians. They could now build their churches above ground, and celebrate the ceremonies of religion openly. The foundations of great edifices consecrated to the service of the true God were laid, and the whole city began gradually to assume a new aspect. Not that the inhabitants willingly renounced their idols, or abstained from the pollution of pagan rites. Long and obstinately did many still cling to their national and household gods, vainly trusting that the day of their dominion would again return. History and what they called religion had become so strangely blended in their minds that they scarcely knew how to tear Romulus from his shrine without blotting the name of their founder from their annals. They loved, too, the bloody arena with its combats of men and wild beasts, and the brilliant festivals which brought a grateful release from labor, or interwove a pleasing variety into the dull monotony of common life. Thus, while the empire accepted Christianity, and the followers of Christ were free to profess their faith openly, they were still surrounded by secret or avowed enemies, who would willingly have renewed the persecution if they could have found an emperor of their own. The immediate bearing of this upon the catacombs you can easily conceive. They were no longer resorted to as the only places which Christians could worship in with safety, but held rather as sacred spots, which helped to keep alive the pure spirit of devotion. It was still good to meet together in them on the anniversaries of the martyrs whose bones they held, and renew at these graves the vows of penitence and renunciation with which they had turned away from the world. These graves gradually became like shrines, which they adorned with marbles and paintings and rich offerings. Then it was that the decorations of the catacombs assumed that form which has supplied such abundant materials for our museums and galleries. The chapels were enlarged and painted and furnished with every thing that was necessary for celebrating the sacred rites worthily. The tombs were carefully watched to preserve them from injury, and many of them decked with inscriptions and sculptures which the original makers must have been either too poor or too much in danger to have placed there. Churches were built over the entrances, giving convenient access to them for the devout, a circumstance which has led to the subsequent distinction of names. Thus, those beyond the gate of St. Sebastian took their name from the church, and those in which we are from the neighbouring church of St. Agnes. As burial places they were held in singular devotion. The Christian might now lay the bones of his brother in any tomb with equal safety. But he loved best these quiet resting places, where his fathers had found refuge in the hour of danger. There was a calm and a peace here unlike the ostentatious grief of the Appian. The ashes of holy men had made the place holy, and the dim galleries, with their countless rows of dead, many of whom he or his father had known in life, were full of eloquent exhortations. He would bring hither the precious remains, and help with his own hands to compose them in their cell, and then perhaps mark out the spot where, when his pilgrimage was ended, he wished to be laid at their side. At a still later period a stronger feeling became blended with this, and men came to look upon burial among the saints and holy men of the day of trial as a privilege which might extend its influence beyond the grave. It was natural for the popes to choose it for their graves. Leo IX. Was buried here as late as the middle of the 11th century. Honorius and Valentinian lie here, and when a new empire of the West had arisen, an emperor from beyond the Alps, the second of the Othos, came to lay his bones in the consecrated soil. Here are the graves of kings of Saxon England, and empresses and queens, and greatest perhaps in the long list of sovereigns, the great Countess Matilda, the friend of Hildebrand, and chief benefactress of the Church. But the day was at hand when Rome herself was to become the scene of the infinite sufferings she had so long inflicted upon others. It is difficult to ascertain what was done with the catacombs in the different sacks of the imperial city. When Alaric took it, there was too much booty in the palaces and houses of the wealthy to leave the barbarians any pretext for disturbing the ashes of the dead. And when 45 years later it fell into the hands of a ruder and fiercer conqueror, there was still enough left to load his ships with silver and gold and statues and vases of precious workmanship. But the records of these great events are imperfect and contradictory. The chronology itself is not always to be relied upon, and when we look for the details that would interest us most, we find but scanty materials for a clear and authentic history. The country around the city was in the hands of the enemy, who pushed their advanced posts up to the gates. They held thus the principal entrances to the catacombs during a greater part of the siege, and Alaric, you remember, besieged Rome 3 different times before he finally took and sacked it. Genseric came from Ostia, but during the Gothic wars the environs were again in possession of the enemy, and when Tortilla retook the city, he threw down the walls and carried the inhabitants into captivity. We know that the monuments of the catacombs suffered more or less at different periods, but what part of the violation must be attributed to the Goths, and what to the Vandals, and what, alas, to Romans themselves, we have no means of deciding. It does not appear that in either siege the inhabitants took refuge here, though it would be natural to suppose that, with so many means of entering them from within the city, and with such certainty of finding in them a sure asylum, they would have fixed upon them as one of the first rallying points in their flight from the Conqueror. My own conclusion from this would be that, during the preceding century, the Christians, ceasing to frequent them as they had done in earlier times, had gradually lost their knowledge of the more intrinsic passages, although certain parts were still used for burial and religious festivals. We know that as late as 352 Pope Liberius took refuge in these very catacombs of St. Agnes during the Arian persecution. But the interior recesses, which had been regarded as the surest asylum when the knowledge of their intricacies were still fresh in the minds of hundreds who had worked and lived in them, would soon become as inaccessible, or rather as difficult of access, to a new generation as they are to us. A long period follows, during which our knowledge of all historical events is so imperfect that we cannot wonder at finding ourselves very ignorant of the history of the Catacombs. Chroniclers who dispatch entire reigns in a sentence, and compress the history of a siege into capta est urbs, can hardly be blamed for passing over a great many things which a more curious age would gladly know in detail. There are blanks of many years in the authentic history of Italy herself. Then comes the period of storm again, that turbulent and destructive age which converted the Colosseum into a fortress, and set battlements upon the beautiful masonry of the tomb of Cecilia Metella; when Virgil was spoken of as a great magician, and the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius attributed sometimes to Constantine, and sometimes to a mysterious soldier of gigantic frame, who had freed Rome from the hand of the barbarians by the help of an owl. In the wars of the Roman nobles, the catacombs were often used as hiding places in danger, and safe spots for conspirators to meet in, and plot their inroads and surprises. Sometimes opposite factions met unexpectedly in these labyrinths, and the fierce war cry rang wildly through the arches, startling, you would almost say, the very bones of the dead. But no general conflict could ever have taken place where the falling of a lamp might plunge both parties in total darkness. It is natural to suppose that the chapels, and even the more ornamented tombs, suffered more or less at the hands of these rude men. The slabs that are found in different parts of the city, and which evidently once belonged to the catacombs, show that veneration for the dead was an insufficient protection against cupidity and violence. But here again we are at a loss for authentic details, and the general history is evident enough to every one who has ever walked around the walls of Rome, or carefully observed the buildings of the Middle Ages. During all this time the catacombs were visited by pilgrims, and occasionally used, as I have already said, for burial. The pilgrims to Rome, Romae, Romepete, were the most numerous of all that numerous class. They came from all parts of Christendom, some as a voluntary act of devotion, some as an atonement for great crimes, and some perhaps led hither by a roving and restless spirit. Occasionally they were attacked by robbers, and sometimes even murdered; but the feeling that moved them was too strong a one to be checked by personal danger, and they continued to flock hither in considerable numbers throughout the whole course of the Middle Ages. It was for their use that the Mirabili and other guide books were written, which, with all their imperfections, are invaluable to the topographical archaeologist. Most of them visited some parts of the catacombs to pray or carry an offering to the tomb of some particular saint, but their devotion would seldom lead them far into the depths of the labyrinth. Some of them even wrote their names on the walls as a record of their visit, and if you are curious about these things you will find the list in Agincourt. The period of study and research began with Bosio, who devoted 30 years to the subject, or rather passed 30 years of his life underground, and died at last before he could enjoy the satisfaction of giving the fruit of his labours to the world. You know the volume, that compact and solid quarto, with its drawings and inscriptions, and a topography that would have driven Bodoni mad. He must have been a rare lover of curious details, that Bosio, and a most persevering fellow, too. Some of his explorations, lamp in hand, crawling along on his knees through passages blocked up with dirt and mortar, and leading he knew not whither, are as adventurous as a search for the Northwest Passage. And then, if he came out at last upon a new inscription, or found wherewith to confirm some previous conjecture, he felt himself richly repaid for his toil and danger. His Roma Sotterranea, and the translation and enlargement of it by Greene, will always be the starting point for a thorough study of the Catacombs. "And how far may we rely," I asked, "on the stories that are told of men being lost in their attempts to explore them?" "Many of them are true," said he. "Delisle has wrought up that of the French artist into a thrilling description." "I have never seen it," said Cole. "I can not pretend to give you Delisle's words," replied the father, "but in simple prose the story runs thus. Sometime in the last century, a young artist, inspired by the enthusiasm of his profession and his age, undertook to explore the Catacombs from one of the entrances in the Campagna, with nothing but a torch and a thread for his guide. As he wandered on through gallery and passage, pausing from time to time to decipher an inscription or sketch a monument, he gradually became so absorbed in his study that the thread slipped from his hand, and he had already gone some distance before he perceived his loss. Immediately he turned back, and tried to retrace his steps. But how should he distinguish amidst the passages that opened on every side the one which had brought him there? He had gone but a few steps when his taper began to fade, and in a few minutes went out. He was standing before an open grave, and the last object that met his eye was the outstretched skeleton. All was darkness and silence. Advance he dared not, for there were pits and openings in the path like those we have seen so many of this morning, and then what had he to gain by plunging deeper into the hopeless labyrinth? He thought he heard a sound, and listened, but all was still. He shouted, and his voice rang through the vaults with a lugubrious knell that chilled his soul. Should he lie down by these bones and die? Should he rush blindly forward and meet a quicker death? Oh, for a ray of the sunlight that was shining so brightly above! Only a few feet, perhaps 10 or 12 feet, and there were the green grass and the pure heavens and the sweet light. And now all his life came back to him, as they say it does to drowning men. All, with its evil deeds and its vain thoughts and its idle hours, and talent misapplied and fond hearts wantonly wounded, all came back fearfully magnified, knocking awfully at his soul as he stood alone where none but God could see him. And so young, and with such hopes, to die this lingering death. But a few hours ago he had set forth so cheerfully to his day's work, and now He could bear it no longer. His brain whirled, his breath came thick and painfully, his limbs trembled, and he sank hopeless upon the ground. But as he sank, his hands touched something there unlike the cold earth. Could he believe it? He draws it cautiously toward him, raises it from the ground. It is his thread. Slowly now and watchfully, step by step, clinging fast to the precious ball, feeling his way with hands and feet lest a misstep should precipitate him into some helpless pit, he winds his course back toward the entrance, and oh, how kindly did the stars look upon him, for the day was long past, and how sweet was the air that came laden with the scents and sounds of life. And is the story of the collegians true also? Too true. There were 16 of them in all, and they went in as a holiday's excursion. It was several hours before any alarm was excited, and then men set out to look for them. I fear they did not do as much as they might have done, but still I know the difficulties of these labyrinths too well to cast my reproaches heedlessly. All that we can say is, that the poor collegians were never heard of again. The padre rose as he spoke, and returned to the gallery. We continued our walk nearly 2 hours longer, sometimes in the first, sometimes in the second tier, and then for a while still deeper in the bowels of the earth. At last, weary almost with our sensations, and silent as the graves around us, we turned upon our steps and ascended to the day. "There are the mountains again," cried Cole. "From their stern heights they have looked down upon Roman and Goth and mediaeval night, and still they stand there, the same calm emblems of duration." And still they stand there in the glorious sunlight, or pointing upward to the stars, as when we stood and gazed upon them together. But thou, friend and companion of happiest hours, from whose sweet converse I drew hopes and thoughts that make life a double blessing, how can I think of them without remembering thee? Years have passed since last we met, years checkered with life's strange vicissitudes, and thou hast long been sleeping in an untimely grave. And when a few weeks ago I sat in the chair where thou didst love to sit, and gazed upon the last touches of thy pencil, and then went forth to the hillside to look upon thy grave, the memory of the hours we had passed together in the homes of the dead came back to me like a dream of yesterday. The awful veil that shuts out the living from the knowledge of all beyond the boundaries of life has been rent, and the mystery of the grave is no longer a mystery for thee. Thou hast stood side by side with those whose bones we touched in veneration and awe, and made thy home with their glorified spirits around the throne of the Almighty. For in heart thou wast of them, even here, and the path by which thou walkest on earth was like that of thine own pilgrim, the steep and difficult path of the cross. Peace to thy remains. Peace to the sweet spot where they lie. Other mountains, thine own dear Catskills, look fondly upon thy slumbers from their calm and majestic heights. The stream thou lovest flows near, and hard by, with its pine groves and shady bowers, stands the home of thy affections. And thy gentle spirit pervades them all, shedding over the landscape the hallowed influences of purifying thought, and making that modest tomb on the hillside a shrine for every sincere admirer of the beautiful and the true. End of Part 4. End of Visits to the Dead in the Catacombs of Rome by George Washington Greene.